His name is Bobby Sneed. He's been behind bars for 47 years for his role in a burglary. He was supposed to be released in March of 2021, but he hasn't been released. This is a very fascinating story. I want to bring on his lawyer. He is Professor Thomas Frampton, Association Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. Mr. Frampton, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for shedding some more light on Bobby Sneed's case.
Thank you. So, for folks who don't know, explain Bobby Sneed's case.
So I don't really know where to begin because it is such a long and convoluted ordeal. But as you indicated, 47 years ago, he was convicted for serving as a lookout in a home burglary where tragically one of the homeowners was killed. So he has been serving a sentence for murder. There were 6 people involved. He's the only one still in prison. The other 2 lookouts, like Bobby, turned state's witness, never testified, and so never went to prison. The others have all been paroled or died. In March of this year, Bobby was paroled. He was allowed to live out his final years with his family. But shortly before his release, 3 days before, he collapsed. His heart stopped, and he nearly died at Angola prison. He was rushed to the hospital, held past his release date, and then instead of being paroled, actually brought back to Angola prison, where prison authorities alleged that he had overdosed, that his heart attack was the result of a drug overdose. Now, the medical records we finally got showed that when he was brought to the hospital, he had pneumonia, he had very full-blown COVID. There's lots of reasons to think he did not overdose. We actually had a trial at Angola prison. He was acquitted and cleared. But then the next day, we found out they were taking his parole anyways. So we have been fighting that essentially ever since. The story gets much stranger, though, because time after time, we have won in court. State court judge in Louisiana has twice granted our habeas corpus petition. The Louisiana Supreme Court has held that Bobby's constitutional rights have been violated by them sort of illegally stripping his parole in the way they did. And yet, nevertheless, he remains today in a jail cell in West Feliciana Parish in Louisiana.
Wow. That is, and so this incident happens 47 years, actually, no, it happens in 1974. And like you said, he has stood guard with 3 accomplices. A home was robbed, and ultimately one of the residents were killed in the home. But he's taken accountability for his role being a lookout. But like you said, everybody else has been released, or they have since passed away. I guess, I mean, I know you kind of broke it down, but it just seems so heinous. How is he scheduled to be released in March? It doesn't happen because they accuse him of doing drugs, whatever the case may be. How? I never heard of somebody, they're supposed to be released and they say, oh no, we changed our mind. Is this illegal? How is this possible?
Yes, it's very illegal. And I want to emphasize the point that you just raised. I mean, Bobby is not being held in prison at this point because of anything related to do with this initial crime 47 years ago. He has absolutely taken responsibility and accountability. When the parole board granted him in parole in March, they made that abundantly clear that nobody regards him as a danger to society at this point. He wanted me to emphasize that he was a U.S. military veteran. He was honorably discharged after serving in Vietnam. So this isn't a case where this is somebody who is a danger to society. Even assuming that what the parole board says is true, that he used drugs at some point this year, it is insane that we are still going to pay $25,000 a year to keep this guy incarcerated. And that number is only going to go up as his medical expenses go up because he's very sick and very old man, especially because we've offered them, look, if you think that he has a drug problem, we will get private charities to pay for any kind of drug treatment, drug rehabilitation that you need on the outside. And the state of Louisiana and the parole board's attitude in particular has just been, how dare you try to question our authority. How dare you try to suggest that everything prison guards allege isn't completely true? And they've been acting punitively against him ever since. And what's really amazing about this case is like you said, it doesn't matter how many times we've won in court. Every single judge that we've been in front of has agreed that what they have done has violated the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And yet, nevertheless, now they're sort of trying yet again to revoke his parole. We're going to have a hearing next week where we sort of go through this whole rigmarole once again. But it's really almost Kafka-esque at this point.
I know this is a hard question to answer, but when I cover wrongful convictions, I ask this question often. But why? Why do you think? I mean, at this point, he's wrongfully behind bars. At this point, he was paroled. At this point, he is wrongfully behind bars. What is the incentive? What is the reason why they want to keep him behind bars? And like you said, spend the taxpayers' money. Have they given any kind of? I know you can't get in their head, but why?
I, I I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think that there is starting to be momentum, and maybe this is just me being overly optimistic, that across the political spectrum, right, we're starting to realize that our addiction to mass incarceration in this country is serving no one. But there's just so much inertia, right? There's so much sort of entrenched bureaucracy. There's so much sense of this is the way that we have always done it. And so the idea that we would sort of suggest that perhaps lifelong incarceration isn't the right thing to do is just alien to a lot of folks. The notion that if somebody does in fact have a drug problem after 47 years in prison, maybe more prison isn't the right place for them, it is just alien to a lot of sort of the way that people think. And look, and race has a huge amount to deal with this as well. Black
Mhm.
folks in Louisiana are approximately 30% of the population, but they represent more than 60% of the population in the Louisiana prison system, more than 70% of the people serving life without parole sentences. So you can't divorce this and what's happening to Bobby from the legacy of white supremacy and its ongoing incarnations. That's about the best that I
Absolutely.
can offer.
Yeah. Mr. Sneed, let me ask you this. So he admits to being an accomplice. He didn't commit the murder, but he admits to being an accomplice. What is his original sentence? What was he originally sentenced with?
He was originally sentenced to life with the ability to have his parole reconsidered after 40 or 45 years.
Okay. So you're a lawyer. I'm going to ask you this. Was that a harsh sentence for the crime he committed? Was that over the top, or was that the sentence that one might say he deserved? I'm just curious to know if they overly sentenced him, rather.
So yes and no. Yes, it's a sentence that's extraordinarily harsh, that it's grossly disproportionate to somebody's culpability. But
Mhm.
no, not under the laws of Louisiana. Louisiana has had some of the harshest three strikes laws in the country. And Louisiana has more people serving life without parole sentences. It's not extraordinary that if he didn't want to snitch, if he didn't want to turn state's witness and cooperate, that they would charge him as an accomplice to a murder, especially in the early 1970s for a black man in Louisiana. It's yes, it's an outrageously harsh sentence, but no, it's not unusual or extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination.
And how old was he at the time of the crime?
He was in his mid 20s. I think he was.
Mm.
So we can work our way back. He actually just had his 75th birthday on Saturday.
Wow.
He would have been, I think, 26 or so. I apologize, I can't do the math that quickly in my head, but I mean, he has spent, at this point, about a third of his life in the free world, and then 2/3 of his life in prison.
And how is he doing right now? How is he?
He had a stroke several years ago. He is infirm. He's a very smart guy, but I like to think that I'm fairly smart too, and I can't understand what's happening. So you can only imagine somebody without legal training trying to make sense of this sort of roller coaster. There have been 3 or 4 times now where he was within minutes of being released, of walking out the gates, only to
Mm,
be rearrested or told there's been some new order in his case. The most recent one was last week. The court yet again ordered him freed. He was technically freed from Angola for about 15 seconds, and then he was re-arrested and transported to a parish prison where he
Jesus.
is now sitting, allegedly because of the new parole revocation proceeding that they're going to start any day now.
Jesus.
I mean, that in and of itself strikes me as
It's
a form of.
torture. Yeah, that's torture. That's just inhumane. That's wow. That's insanity. Uh, you're saying this keeps happening. Do you think he's going to be released anytime soon? What's next?
So, I mean, there's two steps that are next. One is that we're currently in federal court. There's a federal judge who now has jurisdiction over his case, and we are cautiously optimistic that even if the Louisiana courts are indifferent to Bobby's constitutional rights, a federal judge might be more receptive. And the second thing is, it is now undisputed based on the Louisiana Supreme Court's latest ruling that Bobby was held illegally, at least from March 29th, when his parole day came and went, and they just kept him in prison, to December. And we don't expect the Louisiana sort of parole board to care much about Bobby's constitutional rights and his freedom. Hopefully, they'll care a little bit more about the taxpayer money. So we're planning a very large civil rights lawsuit for his kidnapping, essentially, over these past 9 months. But the truth is, look, Bobby doesn't want money; he wants his freedom. But at this point, we're going to think of whatever we can to hold Louisiana state officials accountable who have been showing such contempt and disregard for the Constitution and for Bobby's freedom.
And Professor Frampton, how did you get involved in this case?
So actually, I'm family friends with Bobby's brother, who was himself incarcerated for many decades, has been home now for over 10 years in New Orleans, is a really amazing guy and someone who's contributing to society, who's working, who's helping other folks come home from prison. And so I heard about Bobby's case when he first won parole. I heard about it when all of Bobby's family members from around the country were starting to gather in New Orleans, waiting for him to come home. And then we get this cruel news that, just hours before he's supposed to be released, they're sending him back to Angola for some reason, instead of releasing him from the hospital. So I volunteered to take on the case from the beginning back in March.
Well, thank you for your work and thank you for coming on to spread the news about this story. It doesn't, I mean, normally my audience is a very, active audience, but it appears right now there isn't much that can be done. But I'm going to ask you anyway, is there anything that our audience can do? Should they call somebody or should they just, sit back and let things play out? What's the best thing to do for
No,
somebody listening?
I appreciate it. And I appreciate your audience. I mean, I think that, they should Google Bobby Sneed. If they're on Twitter, they should tweet about Bobby Sneed. They should put it out there on their Facebook pages. This is, it's a case that's now technically before both a federal judge, who we don't want anyone influencing,
Yeah.
are trying to sway, but it's also in front of the Louisiana Parole Board, and the Louisiana Parole Board, the Secretary of Corrections, the Governor of Louisiana, all of them bear responsibility for this sort of madness. And if there's anger to be directed, it's certainly. I think that none of these state actors have covered themselves in glory in how they've handled Bobby's case.
Well, once again, Professor Thomas Frampton, he is the Association Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. He's representing Bobby Sneed. He's been behind bars for 47 years, and he was supposed to be released in March of 2021, and he wasn't. You heard the story here.